this video we're going to be talking about the idea of drawing is thinking. When I discovered this concept, it transformed my ability to both understand the design of buildings and to graphically communicate architectural ideas. To demonstrate this idea, we'll take a quick sketching tour of this building in New York, designed by the architect David Chipperfield. We can use what I call the observational framework to analyze and understand specific aspects of the building while we're sketching. This framework consists of us focusing on context, form, structure, use, and materiality. So, when we think of context, we're trying to understand more than where a building is located. We can be asking ourselves questions like, what are the interesting neighbouring buildings and landscape features? How do people enter the building? How does the sun move around the building? You'll see that by making a simple site plan drawing, the answers to these questions will begin to emerge and we can gain a deeper understanding of the building's context. I start by showing the block structure of Manhattan. The block is basically a little section of the urban fabric that makes up the city of New York. Each block is bounded on each side by consecutive streets. Here I'm hatching in the building itself to graphically define it and give a less dense hatch to the other blocks to make them stand out a bit also. Here I am giving the city blocks a thicker line weight to make them stand out a little bit more. So we can now start to see the surrounding buildings and streets and get a better understanding of the urban fabric. I quickly annotate the streets adjacent to the building. And again add a north arrow which allows us to understand the orientation. Now I'll show a quick street elevation. As you can see, the street's pattern consists of alternating medium and high-rise buildings. The design of this building completes this pattern by introducing an additional structure which has both a small piece and a taller portion. So, when we talk about the form of a building, we're basically talking about its overall three-dimensional shape. If we look at a building from a few different angles, we can start to gain a better appreciation for its volumetric composition. Simple isometric projection sketches are a great way to quickly describe the volumes that together make up the form of a building. In this case, the architect has chosen to express the building's interior uses externally. This is done by dividing up the facade into three sections: the base, shaft, and crown, forming a tripartite composition. By drawing the building from different angles, we can explore the various faces of the building and get a deeper understanding of the overall form. The base takes up the whole width of the site and is made up of more generous ceiling height at ground level. The rest of the base is made up of the first 4 levels of the hotel. Hatching can define the crown, where double height spaces for 2 penthouses at the top of the tower are located. And here I'm using shading to define the outdoor terrace for hotel guests and residential tenants. When we draw the structure of a building, we're really trying to understand the individual tectonic elements, the relationship between these supporting parts, and the overall system that emerges from these connections. So I'm going to use an isometric projection to figure out the structural components. I start by setting up some vertical guidelines. Then I mark out where the location of the individual floor slabs will be. and I can begin to show the concrete columns. By shading in the underside of the floor slab, I can start to show some depth in the drawing. I show the same repeating elements again on the floor above. Hatching a face of the supports adds a little more depth. At this point, I've basically described the main structural elements of vertical columns and exposed concrete slabs. I can add in some more detail to start to understand the additional materials that make up the facade. I add in some more details like the frames of the sliding doors and balcony guardrails. And that's pretty much it. This simple isometric tells me what the structural elements of the building are. And this sketch has also allowed me to start thinking about the materials of the facade. Okay, so now we can look at how the floors of the building have been arranged. By quickly sketching a floor plan, we can gain a better understanding of how the people using this building will occupy some of the interior spaces. I found a typical floor plan online, and I'll be using this as a reference to make the sketch. Looking at the drawings online is fine, but it's a passive way of learning. I think we can definitely learn more by making our own sketches, as it's a more active way of studying something. So I start by showing the key plan and hatching in where this apartment sits within the building footprint and where it is relative to the streets. We already know by doing this simple drawing that the apartment has views over the adjacent park. We can also add in a north arrow to remind ourselves of the orientation. I use a light line way to set up guidelines which establish the overall floor plan layout and the locations of walls and windows. I also mark some dividing points on the perimeter walls to define window locations. Here I'm showing the thicker columns on the north facade and the thinner piers on the west facade. Next, I can locate the windows using the divisions I had set up earlier. I also show the sliding windows and railings of the Juliet balconies. I hatch in the walls to make them stand out a bit. Next, I can start setting up the interior walls. I can see that the architect has lined up some of these walls with the window openings, so I can establish a corner reference point and figure out wall locations from this corner. I use this technique of finding reference points to figure out the location of the kitchen and bedroom walls. Hatching in the walls and supports helps to graphically define them. Here I'm just marking where the entrance to the apartment is. Yeah, and so I continue to add in some more detail by showing doors, appliances, fixtures, and furniture. So now the interior spaces are starting to take shape, and we can see how this apartment would be used by its occupants. I'm going to use a composite elevation section drawing to describe the materials of the facade. Like before, I'm using light guidelines to set up the locations of columns and floor slabs on the elevation. I show the concrete floor slabs and the joint lines of the terrazzo panels. The columns that support the floor slabs are added. Here I'm showing the frames of the sliding doors. The guardrails at the balconies are also added. And finally I use a stippling technique, basically adding dots to show the texture of the terrazzo panels. So I start the section by projecting guidelines from the elevation to set up the floor slab locations. The sliding doors are added. We can see how they're recessed, which helps to create the balcony spaces. Again, I use light projection lines from the elevation to show the guardrails at the right height. Shading the face of the columns and the interior walls adds some depth to the drawing. And by adding a figure to both the elevation and section, we can get a better sense of the scale of the various elements. Okay, now I want to zoom in on this area here and make a really quick sketch detail to get a better understanding of the connections between materials. I don't know how this building was detailed, but I can at least try to figure out the main ideas and start to ask some questions. I start by showing the profiles of both the floor slab and the columns. I then show a very sketchy door frame. Here I'm wondering if a drip edge would have been added to deal with how water runs off the building. Maybe it's there, maybe it's not. What's important is that we're thinking about it by drawing. I show where I think the finished floor might be, and the thickness of the terrazzo panels is also described. I'm not sure how they were fixed, but at least I'm thinking about it. And here I'm wondering about how this guardrail might have been anchored down to the slab. I annotate the various elements, and so I know that this detail may not be an exact reflection of how this building was built, but by drawing what I've observed, I've thought about it and learned a few things along the way. And hopefully you've also learned something from watching this video. If you found this video helpful or have any suggestions or questions, let me know in the comments. And yeah, the next time you have a few minutes to spare, I'd really suggest sketching a building you're interested in. It doesn't have to take a long time. Why not try it out? I find the practice of drawing to be an invaluable way of quickly thinking my way through a building's design. By observing with a focus on specific architectural elements, our sketches can record our ideas and drawing becomes thinking. And thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.